So last time we met together, we worked on investigating in reproductive strategies, and we learned quite a bit about the variety of different kind of reproductive methods that different organisms use. Today I want to just go over a few different kinds of reproductive methods and add a little bit of detail that we didn't add when we went through that assignment. This slide presentation will be on the Schoology site for our class. So if I go too fast through any of the slides, you can either pause it if you want to write stuff down, or you're welcome to look at the Schoology site as well for the slide presentation that you can go through at your own pace. So we're still working on looking at advantages and disadvantages of sexual and asexual reproduction, and we've summarized that, so I'm going to skip through several of these slides and focus on some of the things we haven't really talked about. So one of the things I've noticed in the investigating reproductive strategies that many people have already submitted is that many students have not recognized a major difference in terms of the processes used to make new cells. Almost everyone has recognized that asexual reproduction usually uses mitosis to make new cells, and that sex cells are formed through meiosis, as we can see here in this picture. But what many have failed to recognize is that sexual organisms only make their sex cells through meiosis, and then they use mitosis as they grow and develop into multicellular organisms. So please keep that in mind, that sexual organisms use both meiosis to make the sex cells and then also mitosis in order to grow and develop, while asexual organisms typically just use mitosis both to produce new organisms and for growth or development that happens within an organism. So I'm going to skip some of this because we've already taken some of these notes, and I'm going to talk specifically on some of the methods of asexual reproduction. So we're going to look at these four in particular: binary fission, fragmentation, budding, and parthenogenesis. All of these are asexual. So all of these start with one parent. They all produce clones, organisms that are identical to the original parent. So binary fission, we have talked about in the past, is a way that simple cells like bacteria can make a copy of themselves. We learned this before we even learned what mitosis is. It's a very simplistic process. Basically, the cell makes a copy of its chromosome, which, remember, in these prokaryotic cells would be just one chromosome, not in a nucleus. The cell grows and makes extra copies of itself. It puts the chromosome and the copy on opposite ends of the cell, and then the cell divides into two. That's binary fission. Again, this is used by very simple organisms. More complex organisms have other asexual mechanisms like budding. So budding is when the parent organism, in this case it's an animal called a hydra, forms a little part which is referred to as a bud. You can see it here in this picture. And the bud develops through mitosis, gets bigger, eventually forms kind of like a mini adult organism, and then will break off and live its own life. So this picture here is yeast budding. This is how yeast grows, like the yeast that we use in our breads to make them rise. And this is, again, a fairly common way for asexual organisms to reproduce. A related form of asexual reproduction is fragmentation. In fragmentation, rather than the parent organism forming a small bud organism that then breaks off, a part of the parent organism can actually just be broken off and form a new organism from that. So Many of you have probably heard of things like flatworms, and flatworms, you can cut them in half, or if they get cut in half, they can regenerate the portion of the worm that got cut. So if you cut them in half in the middle, the head part will grow a tail, and the tail part will grow a head. This plant also experiences fragmentation. If you brush some of these little leaflets off that are growing on the edge of this leaf, those leaflets, when they hit the dirt, will develop roots and will grow into, again, an asexual version of this plant, so genetically identical to this parent plant. Another interesting method of asexual reproduction is called parthenogenesis, and we read about this in the Investigating Reproductive Strategies assignment. This is where a asexual female is able to produce eggs that don't need to be fertilized. So they're not eggs produced through meiosis, they're eggs produced by mitosis. So they have a complete copy of the female's chromosomes, a complete copy of her DNA, and that egg is able to develop into a viable adult female that is a clone of the original female. So many different kinds of organisms can do this, including things like water fleas, again, that we read about, many different species of lizards, even things like bees can do parthenogenesis, where they produce a viable mitotic egg. Vegetative reproduction is where plants produce new plants, but not through producing seeds. So you might be familiar with things like strawberry plants, where the original plant can send out a runner that produces leaves, so a long stem that produces leaves, and then when those leaves touch the ground, they will produce roots on their own, and then this runner can be cut, and you have two strawberry plants. Or maybe you've had a garden before or know how potatoes are grown. Potatoes, if you cut them up and plant parts of the potato that have an eye in them, each of those will produce an identical plant. Bulbs, like tulip bulbs, are very similar, where the plant produces this bulb, and you can dig it up and separate it and plant them in different places, and you'll have identical clones of that same plant. Aspen trees are some of the world's biggest organisms, and they have an interesting kind of vegetative reproduction where the root system will grow out away from the tree, and once the roots get far enough away from the tree, some of the roots will grow up, and in that manner they'll be able to form new trees where the roots come to the surface. I'm going to go ahead now and skip through some of these slides about advantages and disadvantages of different kinds of reproduction, and talk a little bit about some specific types of sexual reproduction. So we have already talked about, and hopefully you know something about, sexual reproduction in many animals, including humans, where the animals produce sperm and eggs, depending if they're the male or the female. Those sperm are used to fertilize the egg to form a single-cell zygote. The single-cell zygote then, using mitosis, goes through multicellular development, and then eventually you have the organism that's produced. There are other kinds of sexual reproduction, though, that it would be helpful for you to know about, including sexual reproduction in plants. So many of you probably recognize that flowering parts of plants are the sexual organs for plants. So there's a couple terms that I expect you to know, both for this unit, and then they'll be very helpful for the next unit when we talk about Gregor Mendel and how he learned about the principles of genetics using plants. The male reproductive part of the plant that you need to know is called the stamen. That includes the anther and the filament. And the anther is the location where the pollen is produced and from which it is released. The female part of the plant is called the pistil, and the pistil is made up of multiple parts. Most important for us are the ovules, which are like the eggs of a female plant. Most plants, or many plants I should say, have a way to separate the stamen and the pistil so that they avoid self-pollination, so that instead of having the pollen go from this plant right here to this pistil, but from this stamen to this pistil, they encourage pollen transfer between different plants of the same species. Now that is one common misconception that students have, is that I can take pollen from, for example, a lily plant and transfer that pollen to a tulip plant. Just like that doesn't typically work in sexually reproducing animals, that also doesn't normally work in sexually reproducing plants. You can't take the male tissue from one plant and transfer it to the female of a different kind of plant. In some plants, the male parts and female parts of the flower have been separated onto two different kinds of flower, and the pollen, the male reproductive cells, have to move to the female reproductive tissue, the pistil. Then they will move down through the pistil and fertilize an ovule, and that ovule will eventually become a seed within that plant. It is important to notice that different kinds of plants can have both self-pollination and cross-pollination. Self-pollination would simply mean the pollen from that plant fertilizes the ovules in that same plant. Cross-pollination would be where the pollen from, for example, one pea plant is moved, typically by a pollinator like a bee, to a different pea flower and fertilizes that pea flower. It's also important to note that there are non-animal pollinators like wind or even gravity that can cause the pollen to move from one plant to the next plant. Here's a quick summary of sexual reproduction in plants versus animals and some of the key terms that you will need to know. And then we'll end with just a couple quick things here. As we saw in the reading, there are many organisms that can reproduce either sexually or asexually depending on their circumstances. And when conditions are optimal, they tend to reproduce asexually, and when conditions get a little bit harder, when there's less resources available, then they tend to go into sexual reproduction mode. So is one better than the other? Not necessarily. Here's a chart kind of summarizing what makes sexual reproduction good and what makes asexual reproduction good. And you'll notice as you look at this that the advantages of asexual reproduction are more or less the disadvantages of sexual reproduction and vice versa.